Hello, everybody. I'm Sid Milkis, Senior Fellow at the Miller Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to just a discussion of our nation's democracy and the crises it faces. Certainly a timely and troubling conversation. This event is jointly sponsored by the Miller Center and the Democracy Initiative, and I want to give a special shout out to Bill Anthalis, my boss at the Miller Center, and Melody Barnes, the head of the Democracy Initiative, for making this possible. Our discussion is going to be guided by a terrific new book written by two of my favorite political scientists, Suzanne Mettler and Rob Lieberman. The title of the book is Four Threats, the Recurring Crises of American Democracy. It was published by St. Martin's Press earlier in the year. And this book is a rare combination of rigorous scholarship and careful attention to public affairs. It's a good read. It's really well written, and it probes the deep historical roots of the stress test that American democracy is now going through. Suzanne and Bob are distinguished award-winning scholars, and I could spend the whole hour detailing their virtues, but since I'm anxious to get to the conversation, I'm going to be very brief. Suzanne Mettler is the John L. Senior Professor of American Political Institutions in the Government Department at Cornell University, and she is the author of many fine books, and I guess my favorite book of hers is her book on the GI Bill and the contribution it has made to American civic culture. That title of that book is Soldiers to Citizens, the GI Bill and the Making of the Greatest Generation. That was published in 2007. Rob Lieberman is the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University, and he has an impressive record of academic achievement, including a stint as provost at Hopkins. Rob has also written great books, including Shaping Race Policy, the United States in Comparative Perspective, which was published in 2005, which is an unusually broad look at America's original sin, racial injustice, and how the country has tried to absolve it. I have to say, I've known these guys forever. I knew them when they were in their academic cribs, and it's been a great pleasure for me to see their stars rise. So welcome, Rob. Welcome, Suzanne. Thank you for doing this webinar with me today. Before we get started, I want to thank our audience for joining us. We have a great audience today. And to remind you to use the Q&A function to ask questions. And we'll do our best to get to all of them during this time. Let me start with a question to you, Suzanne. This book is a slightly different path for you and Rob. You've both written a great deal about American politics and American political development. But this attention to the crisis of democracy seems to be an exciting new track for you guys. How did you guys come to write this book, and how'd you come to write it together?
Great. Well, first of all, it's lovely to be here with you at the Miller Center. I've been in person at the Miller Center so many times in the past, and I've always enjoyed it. So I'm sad not to be there in person, but it's lovely that we have this opportunity at least to be together. So thank you so much for Sid for welcoming us. Yeah, this is a different kind of book for me, and I think Rob would say the same, and both of us have been scholars of public policy, and my previous books are all about public policies. This book is about more fundamental things, really, the fundamental aspects that that are necessary to make a country function as a democracy, and looking at them, dangers to them over time in the United States. So both Rob and I are people who, when we were first out of grad school in the 1990s, we taught the big Intro to American Politics lecture course at our respective universities. And that was during the Clinton years. And then we didn't teach it for a long time. And each of us came back to it more recently during the Obama years and found that it was like we were teaching about a different country. And there was a lot of stress on the system. Polarization had increased a lot, and inequality and so on. And then we got to the 2016 election, and we were just racing to keep up. And there were topics like, the legitimacy of elections in the United States, or the freedom of the press, that had seemed long established. And suddenly I was needing to reframe my lectures and to rethink these things because they were seeming more up for grabs. And it was at that point that I started having conversations with colleagues of mine, other political scientists at Cornell, who study democracies around the world and what puts them in danger. And they would say things like, oh, we've seen this all before. And this is very reminiscent of, and they would talk about, the demise of democracies in places like Venezuela and Peru and Turkey and Hungary and so on. And they would say, well, democracies, they don't last forever. They come and they go, and we've had a pretty good run in the United States. And this was mind-bending to me. So as someone who thinks historically about the United States, I wanted to know, well, have we dealt with this before, and when, and under what circumstances? And in conversations with Rob, that led us to writing this book, because we were both curious about these kinds of things. And what could, looking at the past, tell us about the present? Could it illuminate things in some ways?
Yeah, why did you pick these 5 periods that you chose? The 1800s, the 1850s, the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 1790s.
Well, first, let me just echo Suzanne's thanks to you, Sid, and the Miller Center for hosting us. It's really great to be with you, at least virtually. So the focus on those periods came out of a survey of American history and an attempt to identify periods at which there was real fear that the democratic experiment of the United States was at risk of moving backward. We recognize that the United States was not a full, complete, robust democracy from the beginning. That democracy has had to grow and evolve. Many people, African Americans, women, and so on and so forth, were excluded from citizenship and excluded from rights at the beginning. But there is a sense that we've always been trying to move forward as a democracy and to establish greater and greater democratic rights. But there have been these periods when it seemed like we were at risk of going backwards. And sometimes we, in fact, did go backwards. There were real democratic failures: the Civil War, the removal of voting rights for millions of African-American men in the late 19th and early 20th centuries after Reconstruction. So each of these periods, the 1790s, the 1850s, the 1890s, the Great Depression, and the Watergate era, were periods when democracy was under real stress and Americans really genuinely feared that we were at risk of backsliding towards something less than the kind of democracy we had achieved up until that point.
Do you think, Suzanne, as you went through these periods, did it make you think differently about democracy, in the sense that maybe we have not made the kind of progress that the conventional wisdom sometimes suggests we have, that this has really been an ongoing existential struggle over whether to have, not only about what kind of democracy to have, but whether we should have a democracy at all?
Yes, I mean, that's a nice succinct way of putting what an eye-opener this has been for me. I think that, growing up and living in the late 20th century, one could have the idea that I had, that while the United States at the time of the founding had deeply undemocratic institutions most of all, slavery, that the country had, through a long struggles and fits and starts, it had democratized. And democracy, was long and slow in coming, but by the 1960s and 1970s, the United States was really becoming a full democracy. And so in the late 20th century, we were living in this time of great progress. And I did not imagine us going backward from that and democracy receding. And what has been so illuminating about studying these earlier periods is realizing that it was not just a story of progress over time, that there were real fundamental challenges to democracy again and again, times when Americans were really worried about backsliding, and when actual backsliding happened, and sometimes lasted for as much as 60 years, as in the case of the 1890s, taking away the voting rights of African Americans and subsequently their civil liberties and civil rights as well. So that's been, really sobering, and it makes me look at the United States through a different light and to realize how fragile and precarious democracy really is.
Yeah, that chapter on the decline of Reconstruction, the implosion of Reconstruction, and this terrible backsliding, as you describe it, is really, I think, the most engrossing part of the book, but also the most deeply disturbing part of the book, because I don't know that another nation has given freedom to a group of people and then pretty much taken it away in a relatively short time. And so we'll talk more about that period and its enduring effects in a moment. Rob, I wasn't kidding when I said this is well written, which one can't say about all political science. I wish we could say that about all political science books, but God bless us, we're not the best storytellers. But this is really a very riveting book, and so it wasn't just written for academics; it was written for a public audience. And I wonder what lesson you and Suzanne, or you don't have to speak for Suzanne, she can follow up, but what lessons, what do you want people to take away from this story of the wayward path of democracy in the United States?
Well, I think I think there are a couple of lessons. One is, as just to pick up where Suzanne left off a minute ago, we cannot take democracy in the United States for granted. It's been a struggle to achieve it. It's been a struggle to expand it. And it doesn't maintain itself. So I think that's an important lesson. I think one of the things we try to draw out in the book is not only what are the threats to democracy, but what do we mean by democracy, and how do we know when democracy is robust or when it's strong or when it's not? And we point to 4 what we call pillars of democracy: free and fair elections, the rule of law, the idea that everyone is subject to the law equally, and that being in power doesn't put you above the law or outside the law. The idea of a legitimate opposition, the idea that you and I can disagree and have an argument and contest elections and argue about public policy, but not be enemies. And then the final one is what we call the integrity of rights, the maintenance of civil rights and civil liberties and voting rights, the basic rights that people need to have and that need to be protected in order for democracy to work. And in each of the periods that we write about, one or more of those pillars of democracy was really under threat, and in some cases were really destroyed or degraded. And so I think one thing that people can take out of the book is just the idea that we need to pay attention to these things. And I think this election season, which seems to go on forever, is real evidence of that, right? We've been watching, in front of our very eyes over the last couple of months, an assault on free and fair elections, an assault on the idea of a legitimate opposition, an assault on, or an attempted assault on, voting rights. And I think the idea that we need to pay attention to these things and uphold them is really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck. Your book it starts out with a narrative of the enactment, the fight between the Federalists and the Republicans, a deeply polarizing fight, and then a battle over over whether we would have a peaceful transfer of power. But you don't tell the reader when this is taking place. And so anybody reading those first few pages would say, oh, this is, they're starting with Trump and then they're going to move backward. But in fact, this is a discussion of the 1790s. And gosh, if we've ever needed evidence that we can't take our democracy for granted. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've always taught when I teach about this period in the revolution, what Jefferson called the revolution of 1800, I said, wow, what was most important about this was the peaceful transfer of power. It was hard to get, but it happened. And it set this unbelievably enduring precedent. And now we've had this election. So Suzanne, I know this has fascinated you. We've talked about this before. Do you think, are there any lessons about this struggle that took place to bring about the first peaceful transfer of power for our own time, which I think is really I mean, of course, there's a civil war, but outside the Civil War, I don't think there's ever been this kind of protracted battle, this endless season, as Rob put it, over whether or not the losing party was going to accept its loss and embrace a peaceful transfer of power. Can we learn anything important about our own time from studying the Revolution of 1800?
Well, so, in doing the book, we learned from these scholars who study countries around the world that there are these 4 threats that can really endanger democracy. And the first of them is polarization. And what was really striking in looking at the 1790s is that one threat, polarization, which was acting all by itself at that point in time, nearly did the nation in within, its first decade of governance. And it was also striking because many of the political leaders at the time were the same people who had been the founders, and they had been very much opposed to creating political parties, and they thought that they would be really damaging. And then some of them, Madison and Jefferson, become the founders of the Democratic Republican, what becomes a party in time. It's a sort of a faction during the 1790s. And the Federalist Party is quickly emerging among those who are governing, including George Washington and Hamilton and others. And they are quickly at each other's throats. And it emerges over policy differences, but they are so afraid that these differences are going to undermine the Constitution. So they both see each other as an existential threat. They think that having these kinds of disagreements is going to really undermine things. So it escalates so quickly. And then, you get to the election of 1800 and, both sides are arming themselves. They're really afraid that there's going to be violence surrounding the election. And then the election's an impasse and they have to wait 3 months for Congress to meet and to resolve things. And, even then there are multiple votes before they declare Jefferson the winner. And you have the first peaceful transfer of power in the United States from the Federalists who've held the presidency to date to Jefferson being the first Democratic Republican president. But, so that we kind of think of that as a great heroic story of the peaceful transfer of power. But then as Rob and I thought about it more, we realized, and learning from historians, that had it not been for the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, in fact, Jefferson would not have had more votes than Adams. Adams likely would have won again and had a second term, and there would not have been a peaceful transfer of power. So it's a deeply disturbing story because you can't simply walk away from it and celebrate the peaceful transfer of power. In fact, this institutional arrangement in the country that made for this formative rift around race, that slavery was really inscribed implicitly in the Constitution was really shaping things from the outset.
Yeah, the Virginia dynasty wouldn't have happened
Mhm.
without that
Yeah, right.
fifth clause. That's a good segue to diving a little more deeply into this period of the 1890s, which is a really powerful reckoning of this original sin. Rob, as I was reading your book, I thought there were couple different ways to think about these periods, and one way to think of them is like discrete moments of crisis, recurring crises, as a phrase attributed to Mark Twain is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so we have these periodic struggles and some of the same challenges, although they're not the same ones are not always present, but there's a great parallels among these periods. But another way I think we might consider them is as antecedents to develop the crises of our own time. And this period of the 1890s strikes me as a really profound episode that might have left permanent scars on American democracy, or wounds that are still festering more than a century later. And I wondered if in studying this period of the 1890s, if you felt that way about this period.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I'll say that we actually thought about adapting that Mark Twain attributed quote about history rhyming for the title of the book, but that was shot down by our editor. So, but you're very perceptive to notice that. No, I think for both of us, the 1890s chapter and the episode that we recount in that chapter was the most revealing thing that we learned when we were working on this book. I mean, both of us are mostly 20th century people. Mostly what we've written about involves stuff in the 20th century. And so venturing backwards in time to the 1790s, as Suzanne was just describing, or the 19th century was really interesting. So what the 1890s is remarkable for a couple of reasons. First of all, with the title we ended up using for the book is Four Threats, which describes the four core threats to democracy that we chronicle over the course of history. Let me just tick them off quickly. Polarization, conflict is one, is polarization. The second is conflict over who's a full member of the society, who's counted as having full status inside the society. And that in the United States most often expresses itself as conflict over this formative rift of race or immigration. So that's the second one. The third one is economic inequality, high and rising economic inequality. And the fourth is the growth of executive power. And these are things that we know from the study of the rise and fall of democracy in other countries that are threats to democracy. And each of these periods involves some combination of these threats. And that's what's interesting about the historical sweep, is that the threats kind of rise and fall and combine and recombine in different ways. And the 1890s, like the 1850s that led up to the Civil War, the 1890s was a time when three of these threats combined all at once. It was a time of very high polarization, a time of very high income inequality, and a time of racial conflict as the white supremacists in the South tried to fight back against the gains that African Americans had made in the South during Reconstruction. And the story of the 1890s that we tell really focuses on North Carolina, where sort of bolstered by African American voting rights, a biracial coalition of Republicans and populists had taken power in a lot of the state. And the Democratic Party, which was the party of white supremacists, decided in 1898 enough was enough. And we tell a story about Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the largest city in the state at the time, where in 1898, a few days after Election Day, a white supremacist mob backed by the Democratic Party and militia, sort of private militias, essentially staged a coup d'etat. They burned down the Black-owned newspaper in town. They rounded up and killed probably several hundred Black citizens, forced at gunpoint the leaders of the city government to resign, marched them to the train station and sent them out of town. This was a coup d'etat. And this was one instance of something that happened, often less violently, but around the South over the next decade or so, in which the legitimately won voting rights of African Americans were stripped through both legal and extra legal means. And that then, as you say, Sid, led to the rise of Jim Crow, the decline not just of political rights, but of civil rights and for Black Americans throughout the South and in the North as well for decades until the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the gains of the Civil Rights Movement began to reverse some of this tide. So it's a really pivotal moment in the history of democracy in the United States, exactly as you say, not just because of backsliding that happened, but because of the long-reaching repercussions that these episodes had.
So Suzanne, one of the most tragic elements of this story is, as you and Rob point out, this was a really promising moment before the events of 1898 occurred, that something like what Du Bois called abolition democracy was flowering in the United States. And so the setback, it's all the more striking because it was at a moment that seemed to be one of great promise. And one of our members of our audience, Jim Werlin, writes, "The North never had the courage to fully implement Reconstruction after the Civil War." And that's an important observation, I think, because just as Lincoln said, slavery was an American problem, not just a Southern problem. As important as the events Rob just talked about, this coup in North Carolina, the Republican Party seemed to be, with its support mainly in the North, seemed to be kind of complicit in this. Is that an accurate way to think about it?
Well, what we learned, and we're learning this from historians, our work is very much one that builds on the work of historians and some political scientists like our friend Rick Valley, who studied this period. So they find that, Republicans in the North really up through the 1880s at least had been on the side of Black voting rights. And so, even after the demise of Reconstruction, African Americans are still voting at pretty high rates in most states, not all, but most states in the South, and are running for office at all levels. Some became the first Black members of Congress, but in addition, the state level and the local level, it's really striking. And then that begins to shift as the Republican Party in the North starts to change its focus and put it elsewhere, like on winning votes in the West, for example. And it seems that there's a generational divide, as some of the older Republicans still really want to stay with, the fight for Black civil rights and voting rights. But younger Republicans are saying, this is a losing battle and we're not interested, and let's focus elsewhere. And so Congress misses an opportunity to really strengthen these rights in the early 1890s. And then that leaves these Black Republicans who are working together with the populists as fusionists, that leaves them kind of defenseless when they are starting to gain power, and then the Democrats turn on them. And at this point, African Americans make their pleas to Washington, D.C., to Republican President McKinley to come to their aid, and he does nothing. And then the same is true for the next several Republican presidents, that they really look the other way as Southern Democrats are eviscerating voting rights in all of these states. And then ultimately, as Jim Crow gets established, then it does as well in the federal bureaucracy. And so there's real complicity by Republicans at that point.
In fact, one might say that no president really takes on Jim Crow with the full powers of the presidency until Lyndon Johnson. So it's really telling how powerful this bargain struck in the 1890s is. And I wanted to shift to the presidency for a moment, because that's another recurring theme, particularly in your discussions of the 20th century. And so Rob, you talk about the danger of executive aggrandizement being the democratic crisis of the 1930s, and we often think of FDR as a benign leader, but the seeds of the imperial presidency might be there. And although you and Suzanne are too subtle and scholars to point a direct line between FDR and Donald Trump, I wonder if you talk a little bit about how deeply and dangerously the powers of the modern presidency, which is consolidated during the New Deal, have been, to how dangerous that a threat that is posed to American democracy.
Yeah, well, and here I'll tip my cap to you, Sid, because you're one of the scholars that we learned an enormous amount from about the rise of presidential power and the sort of implications of presidential power for American democracy. Yeah, I mean, this is really a lot of the story of American politics in the 20th century is the story of the growth of presidential power, which of course begins before Franklin Roosevelt. But Roosevelt takes office in 1933 at a moment of really grave crisis for liberal democracy and capitalism. It's the depth, the trough of the Depression. Americans are looking across the Atlantic at regimes in Europe that are falling to various kinds of authoritarianism or totalitarianism, and many people are looking to Roosevelt here in the United States to assert his authority. And the first thing that he does, his first day as president, is what does he do? He shuts down the banks to give his administration some time to figure out how to stabilize the financial system. So his administration starts with this audacious act of presidential power. And then over the course of the New Deal and World War II, the power of the presidency grows tremendously. Mostly not because the president seizes power in a dictatorial sense, but because Congress gives it to him. The presidency itself grows, the White House staff, the executive office of the president is established. The president gets policy authority, the administrative state grows, which gives the president a lot of managerial control over what the government does. Roosevelt tries to push it even farther with, court packing in 1937, which doesn't succeed. But the one emblematic moment that we point to that's less well known is in 1940, just as the United States is on the edge of getting into World War II, and Roosevelt is consumed with anxiety about Nazi subversion inside the United States. And he signs a secret memo that actually turns out was authored by J. Edgar Hoover, who was already the director of the FBI. He crops up all over the place, it turns out. Roosevelt signs a secret memo authorizing the Justice Department and therefore the FBI to engage in illegal wiretapping. And he says, mostly you should do this to people who aren't American citizens. But if it needs to be broader than that, the president will look the other way is basically the message. So there's an example of the way in which Roosevelt, who really was a savior of democracy in a sense, he left, I think, American liberal democracy stronger than when he found it. He guided the United States through the Depression and through World War, these world historical calamitous events, without succumbing to the kind of democratic degradation that we saw in Europe. But he, embraces the new powers of the presidency and plants the seed for this kind of unilateral presidential action that, when amplified further by the growth of the national security state during the Cold War, gives, let's say, less scrupulous president the tools to use presidential power to serve his own ends, which is what we see with Richard Nixon in the 1970s, and then sort of on steroids with Donald Trump over the last 4 years.
Yeah, and as you point out, when the national security state is extended to homeland security, that's an additional very important layer of this executive aggrandizement. Suzanne, why do you think these, let's get to the contemporary period more directly. Why do you think these four things are emerging now, that we're seeing all four threats?
Yeah.
We're really lucky in our own time. We've got all four of these things to think about and worry about.
Well, as we study the four threats, they each wax and wane over time throughout American history, and they each have their own pattern, and they combine in different ways at different times. So, Rob is talking about the 1930s, sort of through the middle of the 20th century was when executive aggrandizement was becoming greater, but it was a threat all by itself at the time. So, for example, like you get to Watergate, and while Nixon is then using these executive powers for his own political gain and abusing these powers, but Watergate is still contained. And we think it's contained because the other threats were at a kind of a low ebb at that point in time. But since then, the others have been growing. So executive aggrandizement has been growing pretty steadily and aided a bit and abetted by presidents of both parties since the 1930s. But the other three have each had a different rhythm. Political polarization, very strong, is recently in the Civil War period and the 1890s, but then is at a lower ebb through the middle of the 20th century, but it's been growing since at least you could say the 1980s, and really intensifying over the past couple of decades now. And then meanwhile, economic inequality has been on the rise since the early 1970s. And then finally, the fourth threat, conflict over who belongs, and in particular along the lines of race. This we might have thought was declining. And here the nation elected its first Black president in 2008. But, it was very soon after that when, in fact, Donald Trump starts the birther conspiracy. The Tea Party movement also, while it was initially associated with concerns about taxes and government spending, actually also becomes very anti-immigration, and is really catering to these sort of appeals to race. So the Republican Party in this era of polarization begins to combine polarization with this conflict over who belongs with, and when you have that kind of a conflict, one side in the conflict typically wants to go back to the way things were, to restore some kind of existing social hierarchy in society, in this case along the lines of race, whereas the other side wants greater equality. And the Democratic Party, meanwhile, the contemporary Democratic Party, particularly since 2012 on, is more and more embracing of equality than it's ever been, and arguably than any party in American history has ever been. So this sets you up for this kind of polarization. So what we're seeing today is the combination of all four threats. And, you know, the biggest takeaway of our book is that we've never had this before. We've never had all four. We had major disasters when we had three of them combined in the 1850s that led to the Civil War, when three combined in the 1890s that led to a half century plus of disenfranchisement. But now we have all four. So we think it's a very serious situation.
Yeah, we're getting, we have some questions here on polarization from our audience. Rob asking the very fundamental question of whether the kind of polarization Suzanne was just describing is essentially an existential threat to democracy, whether democracy can survive in the face of such threat, particularly when it's you know, also it's agitated by executive aggrandizement and these fights over exclusion, which you guys talk about so effectively. So what are your thoughts on polarization? I mean, it's hard for me to see like Joe Biden becoming a president of reconciliation, of unity in the way that he's expressed hope. And so we're going to have continuing polarization and partisan combat. Can democracy survive the polarization in the midst of these other three threats that you guys evaluate?
Well, I think the way you frame the question is exactly right. I mean, polarization is itself challenging, and we see that in the 1790s, which is a moment where polarization is really the only threat, or exists, you know, sort of by itself. Excuse me, in the absence or relative absence of the other three threats, and even that by itself in the 1790s leads to this existential crisis of the young republic, and as Suzanne described a few minutes ago, you know, this near collapse of democracy. So even polarization by itself is challenging, and by polarization, what we really mean is the sort of devolution of politics into this sort of real us versus them kind of enterprise. Right, not just ideological disagreement or conflict or arguments over public policy, but the real sorting of the public into warring camps, into us and them groups that don't sort of recognize the legitimacy of the other side, as you're seeing with the you know, conspiracy theories about the election, for example. But I think what's really dangerous, and what we really learned when we were examining all of these periods, is that it's the combination of threats that's really dangerous. So, for example, as you just suggested, you know, polarization combined with executive aggrandizement, you know, with excessive presidential power, gives the president who sees himself, and again, something we've learned from you, Sid, a president who sees himself not just as the president of the country, but as the leader of a party, gives the president both the opportunity and the motive to use the tools of a very strong presidency as a political weapon against the opposition. So it's, and that gets even further exacerbated when partisan conflict is along racial lines or along lines of economic class or inequality. So it's this combination of threats that makes polarization ever so much more dangerous.
Yeah, and these battles over American identity, it's hard for them not to become existential. So it's not surprising a lot of people refer to our own time as a cold civil war. Let us hope it remains it remains cold. Suzanne, we've got a question here regarding polarization, asking about the parties and whether it's not put quite this way, but the meaning is there. Are they both equally at blame? Do we have is the polarization one that both teams, as you guys put it, are battling without limit, or is the Republican Party, as a lot of people have argued, more militant, more tribal in its partisanship than the Democratic Party?
So
How do you guys view the competition between the parties right now?
yeah, so we entered our analysis without an answer to this question, and with the assumption that, you know, polarization is a relationship and it takes two sides, and that presumably both sides would bear responsibility. And you know, we left the contemporary period on the shelf while we studied all of these other periods and really learned a lot, I think, about the dynamics of polarization. And what we learned is that when polarization, you know, to some extent, polarization is a good thing for democracy. It means that you have, you know, different points of view, and that gives voters a choice. If you have, you know, different policy alternatives that two parties are each championing. But what becomes dangerous is, as Rob is saying, when it gets to be this battle of us versus them, you treat each other as enemies. And then it becomes particularly dangerous when one party or the other decides we need to pursue victory at all costs. We don't care if democracy is dismantled in the process. And that's when it's fundamentally dangerous. So then when we're studying the contemporary period, you know, it begins, you know, coming out of the civil rights era. You have Democrats in the South. White Democrats are gradually moving away from that party and gradually moving toward the Republicans, and the parties are sorting themselves out. It all begins at the grassroots level. And then by the late 1970s, you have congressional leaders, Republicans like Newt Gingrich and Dick Cheney, who are saying, you know, we could start winning more often around here if we would distinguish ourselves from the opposition and stop playing Mr. Nice Guy and really be more combative. And so they start using all of these sorts of strategies. But then the Democrats respond in kind, and there's some back and forth between them. And that kind of continues until, you know, as we get into this century, the 21st century. But then the Republicans really begin to pull out the stops more, and really particularly from, I would say, the Tea Party era on, where they become willing to sacrifice democracy if it means winning. And, you know, we've just seen that a lot over the last 4 years, and we've seen it now over the last couple of months in the wake of the 2020 election, where many Republicans are willing to forget about democratic principles in the desire to win.
And really taking advantage of some of the opportunities in the Constitution to advance minority concerns. The Electoral College, the Senate, and now deeply ensconced in the courts. Is this, I don't know, that's in some ways this kind of minoritarian politics, you could, if I may, reminds me a little bit of what happened in the 1890s, not thankfully yet to the violent degree that occurred then, but there is this kind of desperate attempt to hang on to the past in the face of a future that looks very different. Rob,
Yeah.
do you go ahead, Rob?
I was going to say, I think that's right. I mean, I think another parallel is with the 1850s, where in the run-up to the Civil War, you know, Suzanne mentioned the 3/5 rule clause of the Constitution before, that helped tip the 1800 election to Jefferson. But a further effect of the 3/5 clause, which gave white voters in southern states and slaveholding states extra representation, in a sense, in Congress, in the Electoral College. One effect of the 3/5 rule was to help keep slavery off the agenda of national politics for several decades, but also to give the South the ability to, you know, appear to be abiding by the rules of democracy without having to sacrifice their devotion to slavery. By the 1850s, what began to happen was the anti-slavery movement was growing. The North was becoming more powerful and more populous compared to the South. And the South eventually had to choose between their devotion to democracy and their devotion to protecting slavery. And when faced with this stark choice between slavery and democracy, they chose slavery over democracy. And I think it's that kind of temptation when winning and when achieving your political goal is more important than preserving the practices and norms of democracy, that's when polarization becomes really dangerous. So there's another parallel.
Yeah. There's someone just, Jim McCaffrey just asked the question about whether gerrymandering is an important part of this kind of struggle between the past and the future now. Do you guys see that as a existential, a real part of these existential threats to democracy and something that would need to be addressed?
I could jump in on that. I would not put gerrymandering in the category of existential threats. In fact, a lot of political scientists who study it, and it's not something that's my forte, but find it to be less important than a lot of citizens assume. And one of the reasons why is because we're in this period where a lot of what is going on is partisan sorting. And so urban areas now tend to be densely packed with Democrats. And then more rural areas tend to be more diverse politically, but disproportionately Republican. And because we have geographic districts, that means that as long as you're drawing district lines and you have a sorted population, it is really difficult to draw them equally. You're in fact going to have more districts where Democrats are wasting their votes. Democrats live in an inefficient way. The best thing Democrats could do if they want to start winning elections is to move, to move so they're more widely distributed. And that's really the problem. So I think that's more fundamental than the way district boundaries are drawn.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Rob, did you want to add?
It is. I agree with that. I think we probably have a tendency to overstate the impact of gerrymandering, but it is an example of a party, and both parties do this, although the Republicans, I think, in the last decade or two have gotten to be real masters of it. But it is an example of a party manipulating the rules in order to win.
Yeah.
And so that, along with voter suppression and other things that parties have been engaging in, and I would say more the Republicans than the Democrats recently, I would say tend to fall into this category of sort of win it, that can tilt over very easily into the sort of win at all costs dynamic that Suzanne was describing a little while ago.
So we're getting a little short on time, so I wanted to. We've touched on it certainly, but I wanted to directly focus on this unbelievable election that just happened and is still happening. And I'd like to get you both to comment. I'll start with you, Suzanne, on what promising things do you see stemming from this election, and what perils do you see? I guess the perils are a little more obvious to us right now. So, but I wonder if you. And that would give Rob a chance to respond.
Yeah, what an extraordinary election, on so many
Isn't it weird?
levels.
Yeah.
It really is amazing. I mean, here we are, in the midst of this pandemic, and yet we had the highest voter turnout that we've had since 1900. I mean, that's really extraordinary that people cared that much and came out, and that's a sign that democracy is healthy. And so that was, a real positive thing. And you have the fact that both judges and state and local officials in all these weeks since, as Trump has tried to pressure them, and the Trump campaign has tried to pressure them to overturn the results of elections, they have stood up for the rule of law and reinforced free and fair elections. And so all of that is really terrific. And we do see Trump as having been a real danger to democracy. And so the fact that he has been voted out of office is, again, that's huge. At the same time, there's a lot that's really sobering coming out of this election. And in particular, it's the way that it has been challenged for all of these weeks since then, and delegitimized by Trump and so many of his supporters. in a way that's really extraordinary. And what is the implication of all that? I mean, they have failed to overturn the election, but it's concerning to me because, for one thing, it will make it more difficult for Biden to govern. A basic principle of democracy is the legitimacy of the opposition. And so if you win an election, you're supposed to be able to govern, but this is weakening him in those respects. But in addition, it's problematic to me for the future of what does it mean if we get away from this idea that there's a peaceful transition of power. Then, what happens in the next election if it's closely decided by just one state? Like more like the year 2000, I can see it that all of these difficulties being much more problematic then.
So we survived the stress test, but by the skin of our teeth, barely.
Yes.
There's no reason to be complacent about the future. Rob, what would you like to add?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Suzanne just said about the election. Let me pull the lens out a little bit more broadly and look not just at the election, but at this extraordinary year that thankfully is coming to a close very soon. We can only hope that 2021 will be better. But one of the great challenges that you didn't need our book to tell you this, but one of the great challenges for American democracy is to build a truly multiracial democracy, a really inclusive democracy. And one of the sobering things that we've seen over history is time and time again, the resolution of crises involves, backsliding for African Americans, or the removal or ignoring of African American political rights, either because the parties agree. In the 1790s, the slavery was not an issue of disagreement between the parties, or because, as in the 1890s, we actively removed rights from Black Americans. And so one of the hopeful things that I've seen this year has been the Black Lives Matter protests coming, after the murder of George Floyd and others in the spring. But the national reaction to that and the extent of the protests that followed, again, in the middle of a pandemic, the wide diversity of people who are participating in protests, the fact that marches and other protest activities took place not just in big cities where you might expect them, but in rural communities and in suburban communities, suggests to me that maybe we're ready for some kind of reckoning with, what you said called the original sin of American politics. Not that this is an easy fix or that there's anything obvious that we can do. There's a lot of conflict and a lot of politics between here and there. But I think the fact that so many Americans seem to be taking on board the challenges of systemic racism that have really hampered American democracy for so long, I think that's maybe a little bit of a hopeful sign.
Do you think, Rob, that the Democratic Party, right now, there's, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of tension between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Biden administration, as there always is between social movements and the White House. But the Democratic Party, as Suzanne, I think, said before, has been kind of evolving, sometimes haltingly, as a party committed to a multiracial society. Reminds me of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. Do you think that the Democratic Party in the next 4 years could begin to put together a strong coalition that would advance for the first time in a significant way this kind of multiracial society that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think they could. I think it'll require leadership. Whether Biden is the leader, is the next Lyndon Johnson. I think you were right about Lyndon Johnson. Whether Biden is the next Lyndon Johnson, I'm a little skeptical. But I think we just elected our first, not just our first woman vice president, but our first person of color to national office. A Black American and an Indian American. in that office. I think that's significant. I think she'll be a figure in the Democratic Party for a long time to come, Kamala Harris. So I think there's hope. But as you say, you know, it's a big and raucous coalition, the Democratic Party, and I think how they navigate through the next 4 years and through some of these issues will be really telling.
What are your hopes for the Biden administration, Suzanne, or concerns?
Yeah, well, you know, I think that a lot of, you know, Democrats had the hope, of course, that Democrats would take the Senate, and then there would be all sorts of policy initiatives that would come out of the Biden administration, and that hasn't happened. And it's going to be really difficult for him to accomplish a great deal legislatively, given, you know, what we've seen over the past many years with the way the Republicans will be likely to simply say no to a lot of initiatives. And that will leave Biden with the administrative state, which is, you know, the sort of the catch-22 of where we're at in American politics, that presidents, in order to deliver on some of their promises and to satisfy their party, they turn to these executive powers in order to get things done. I actually think, though, I mean, what Rob and I have seen in doing the analysis of the last few years is, you know, real damage to a lot of those administrative agencies, which had become really a bulwark of democracy in many ways. So staffing them with strong, competent, professional people and getting them to do the work of government again and to implement laws effectively will be great progress. And I think that the Democratic Party today, I mean, it's a very interesting party. It has to be a big tent. It includes moderates and liberals and progressives all in one party. Biden's got to try to keep that together. But in doing so, it represents a much broader group of people ideologically. And I think that simply symbolizes a lot about what it takes to be a democracy, that you have to tolerate difference and say, we're going to get along by, you know, playing by the rules of the game. So that would be my hope.
Yeah. Well, it's sad to say we're out of time. I wish we could spend all day together. I wish you were here so I could take you to dinner. Thank you both so much for writing such a great book.
Thanks so much, Sid. We really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's been such a pleasure. I miss you guys. I hope to see you soon. Thanks to my colleagues, my wonderful colleagues at the Miller Center who make this happen. And thanks to our wonderful audience who joined us today. So everybody have a good weekend. Stay safe. Looks snowy out there. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.